Well, it's always so nice to be with you all, and I appreciate Kathy's invitation to speak about the Happy Hill Cemetery and the ground penetrating radar project that I facilitated there last year. So, hold on to your seats. We're going to go through a lot of time here, going back in time and then up to the present. So, the Happy Hill Cemetery is a historic graveyard located at a high point in the Happy Hill neighborhood, which was established as a freedmen's community in 1872. The cemetery is a significant historic and sacred part of this first planned African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem and is a contributing site in the Old Salem National Historic Landmark District. Interments include members of Happy Hill's founding families, as well as later residents and those from other parts of the city. Nearly 1,500 burials were recorded from the 1890s into the 1960s. The cemetery, though, like the neighborhood, has suffered a series of negative and long-lasting impacts resulting from racist public policies for over a century. Happy Hill is a post-Civil War extension of the town of Salem, and Old Salem has been involved in the Happy Hill neighborhood since at least 1989, when the museum began restoring the St. Philip's Moravian Church complex. Historians and archaeologists were engaged for new scholarship, and Mel White was hired as Old Salem's first director of African American programs. He conducted major research on African American history, especially in the Moravian archives, and surveyed the Happy Hill Cemetery, documenting all the visible grave markers. Mel White is an excellent genealogist, who you may know, and he developed a significant genealogy database for African Americans in Salem and Wachovia, which is invaluable to our research. The connection he made among branches of the Peter Oliver descendants were transformative for that family. Significantly, he led the gathering of oral histories and photographs from Happy Hill residents and descendants for the 1998 exhibition titled Across the Creek from Salem, The Story of Happy Hill. 3 years ago, we revived the exhibit as selections from Across the Creek, Happy Hill, with updates for current activities, including the Shotgun House Project. The exhibit is dedicated to Mr. White, upon whose shoulders we stand. The exhibition is free and open to the public in the Old Salem Visitor Center, and is also digitally available on our website. You just need to search Old Salem exhibitions, and you'll find this link to all of the photographs and the documentation about the history of the place. So I submit this to you for further inquiry if you're interested. 15 years ago, my husband, the director of archaeology, Mo Hartley, and I were facilitators at the restored St. Philip's complex in Old Salem. And during this time, we had important encounters with Happy Hill. My husband had already overseen excavation at the Schumann House site in 1999, and our new relationship with the Liberian organization, the Piedmont, provided their historic connection to the Happy Hill land through the 1830s immigration of Dr. Schumann's manumitted people to Liberia. In 2010, the Liberian flag presentation in St. Philip's Church with notable dignitaries solidified the museum's commitment to their story. Another relationship builder was with Happy Hill descendant Maurice Pitts-Johnson. Becky and I were talking about Maurice, who requested help from Old Salem archaeology for the retrieval of Happy Hill Cemetery, where her grandparents are buried. The photograph at the right shows Mrs. Johnson and her grandson, Brian Bonner, with Mo at the inaugural community cleanup, where 75 people turned out. Since then, Mrs. Johnson organized regular volunteer cleanups and connected with the nearby Rising Ebenezer Baptist Church. A flagpole was erected and a sign indicating Happy Hill Cemetery. Memorial services have been held and veterans' graves are marked with flags. But Mrs. Johnson is now over 90 years old, and she worries about locating descendants for perpetual maintenance of the cemetery. She has tasked her grandson, Brian, for assistance. In our archaeology files at Old Salem, we had documentation that I knew would be of use. And following a conversation with Mrs. Johnson in early 2023, I invited Brian to be a community research fellow with me that fall. Our goals would be working toward descendant identification and applying for a City of Winston-Salem historic marker for Happy Hill Cemetery. When Mo and I were working on expansion to the Old Salem National Historic Landmark in 2012, we were keen to include as much of Happy Hill as we could defend with the National Park Service, and the Happy Hill Cemetery is included. Of great help to us was Judy Stanley Cardwell, who generously shared her excellent research on Happy Hill. She worked with the Rural Initiative Project led by Angelo Francesina and Gregory Hairston. In the early 2010s, their work targeted Happy Hill and specifically the cemetery. Judy was a dear friend and a superb researcher who shared her knowledge. I miss her very much, and I know you do too. Phyllis Hoots and I are pictured here with Judy, and the only photograph I have of Judy. This was taken in 2007 by our friend Barbara Spainhour during a Stokes County Historical Study tour of Germantown. In 2012, Judy compiled a database of nearly 1,500 people buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery, based on death certificates and other primary sources. This is page 1 of 145 pages of an alphabetized list in PDF format. The list is critical as there are only about 100 grave markers visible. I knew the list was invaluable and could ultimately help Brian and his grandmother locate descendants, but it needed to be more usable. My data science son converted it to an Excel file and taught Brian Excel. This is Brian working on the spreadsheet. In that spreadsheet form, the data is manageable and provides analytical options. And Brian has been updating the cemetery list with new information. Also, Brian and I successfully applied for a City of Winston-Salem historic marker, and it will be installed this spring, bringing greater awareness to the cemetery. In addition to sustained maintenance, Happy Hill Cemetery challenges include retrieval and identification. The sacred ground has been intruded on in severe ways. About 100 grave markers are visible, as I said, but many are damaged, and row after row of slumped ground indicates additional graves and otherwise unmarked burials. Visible funerary tradition includes a variety of grave markers and family plot borders. Last year's geophysics project, the GPR, was hugely important, and I will share the results. But first, let's review our history for some context. The Moravian Church's renewal in the 1720s in Saxony, now Germany, led to global missionary work through the patronage and leadership of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. The first permanent Moravian settlement congregation in America was Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1741. A decade later, the Moravians entered into an agreement with Lord Granville for the purchase of 100,000 acres of his North Carolina land. A survey made in 1752 by Bishop Spangenberg led to the selection of the land they named Wachovia, encompassing the Muddy Creek drainage basin in the Yadkin River basin of North Carolina. Although the search party had encountered Native Americans, indigenous people had already been pushed from the Wachovia land, and we must acknowledge colonialization, land theft, and subjugation in America. The new Moravian colony was started at Bethabara in 1753, followed 6 years later by Bethania. In 1766, the Central Settlement Congregation of Salem was begun, and during its construction, the three country congregations of Friedberg, Friedland, and Hope were initiated, so that in 20 years' time, Wachovia was generally structured as Moravian leadership in Europe had planned. In the broader tract, land was also available to non-Moravians. Ambitious Moravian plans were constrained by a small population, and renting labor, white and black, brought them into direct relationship with enslaved people. Like most religious groups in America, the Moravians did not object to slavery, but regarded one's place in life as ordained by God, with salvation the key. The Wachovia Moravians purchased their first human being in 1769, the year the Single Brothers House on Salem Square was completed. Called Sam, he was baptized 2 years later as Johann Samuel and became a spiritual equal, a Moravian single brother who was enslaved by his brothers, a great paradox. A small number of enslaved people chose conversion and were considered spiritual equals. This integrated fellowship included worship and burial practices as well as educational opportunities. In the theocratic town of Salem, slave ownership was limited to the church, with the hope of keeping enslaved numbers low and the Moravian work ethic high. But as Wachovia developed, so did the barbaric practice of slavery, which would come to distinguish the Southern American Moravians, where Wachovia was founded and built by European-derived people and African-derived people. The Moravian tract evolved into the city of Winston-Salem. The Salem town lot was 3,159 acres and about 2 miles across, with town centered on Salem Square, where I walked off a green square. The grid was laid out on a ridge over the Salem Creek bottom. Salem was a theocratic community and the church owned the land. It was a town of trades and professions, and southeasterly across Salem Creek, the 300-acre Salem plantation was established in 1769 to provide commodities. This is the land that will become Happy Hill a century later. The Integrated Fellowship for Afro-Moravians did not last, and by the end of the 18th century, spiritual equality was framed. The Sacred segregated in 1816 when the Negro God's Acre was established, followed by a separate Negro congregation in 1822, and the log church was built the next year. The Salem farm across the creek was never very successful and transitioned to the Schumann farm in 1815 when Dr. Henry Schumann moved from Bethania to be Salem's physician, and with him his invalid wife and the people he enslaved, including Celia and her children. Salem's slave regulations prohibited residents from owning enslaved people in town, and Dr. Schumann was located out of town on the farm across Salem Creek, and a 2-story frame house was built. The number of enslaved people grew, and the farm became successful. In 1836, Dr. Schumann wanted to move into town where he was not allowed to bring the people he enslaved. He manumitted the 17 people he owned and sent them with 6 other free people to Liberia, the new colony for freed American slaves in West Africa. Salem and Liberia have a deep connection, which is honored today through the efforts of the Liberian Organization of the Piedmont. The City of Winston-Salem historic marker in Happy Hill acknowledges the history. The marker is located about 700 feet upslope from the Schumann house site on Liberia Street. Following Dr. Schumann, the farm was leased to other Moravians. In 1840, the Moravian painter Daniel Welfare lived there and painted this important landscape of his home and surroundings, looking back across Salem Creek to the town. The Schumann house is at the right in the foreground near the horses. The artist's point of view was from the vicinity of present-day Happy Hill Cemetery. In Salem, the church controlled the ownership of enslaved people for a time, but renting enslaved people on an annual basis was usually approved for residents. Emerging entrepreneurship and industrialization in the 1830s added pressure to end the slave regulations by 1847. Forsyth County was created in 1849, with Winston soon named the new county seat. The towns grew side by side. Architecture informs change. In this 1850s photograph of the stylish new Salem Academy building, columns and hooped skirts recall the Old South. The figures may not all be Moravian, but the scene reflects a southern town. In 1860, the last federal census before emancipation reported that 14% of Forsyth County's population was enslaved, men, women, and children. In Salem and Winston, 400 people were enslaved in households, farms, businesses, and industries. The Wachovia countryside was mostly small farms, with or without slaves, but there were also large productive farms and plantations using enslaved labor. Bethania was always the largest Moravian slave-holding community. At the end of the American Civil War, freedom was announced in the African Church in Salem on May the 21st, 1865. The freedmen prioritized education for their children, and on the former Schumann farmland at the Brothers Spring, a parcel was provided rent-free by the Salem Moravian Church. At the location near the Walltown Road, the freedmen built their school in 1867, the first school post-bellum for African American children in Salem. The Schumann farm continued to figure prominently in the landscape of freedom. Some Salem residents had objected to freedmen buying property in town, and the Salem Church trustees settled on a segregated solution across the creek. In 1872, around the former Schumann House, they began development of a little town, Liberia, and lots were available to freedmen for $10 each. Soon known as Happy Hill, it was the first planned African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem. The first Happy Hill property owners were men who had been enslaved in Salem and vicinity, including Ned Limley and Richard Sievers, who received lots 1 and 2 respectively in a transaction that involved the white Salem resident H.A. Limley. Peter Stockton, Martha Lindsay, Elias Bidding, and others soon followed as new property owners. They made homes for their families in the 1870s as the first of many African Americans to live in Happy Hill. Ned Limley was a grandson of Phoebe and Bodney, communicant Afro-Moravians purchased by the Salem Church in 1810 with 2 of their children, including Ned Limley's father, Emmanuel, who was also called Man. Phoebe, Bodney, and children were placed at the Wachovia Plantation, called the Negro Quarter, a 50-acre farm at the southeast corner of the Salem town lot where Bodney was farm manager. Phoebe and Bodney were founding members of the Negro congregation, which became St. Philip's Moravian Church. Kathy's not in here, but 2 years ago, Kathy Boyer contacted me during her research on a story about Laura Limley, a founder of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Winston-Salem, there she is, who had lived in Salem. Kathy, I just said you contacted me 2 years ago about Laura. In 1851, Miss Limley, and her portrait is there from Kathy, had moved from Bethania to Salem with her parents and grandmother. The question to me was, where did they live, including the enslaved people owned by Laura's family? The Limleys were a very well-to-do family with wealth from 2 of the largest slave owners in Bethania, Jacob Conrad and John Christian Lash. We had researched the Limley Salem lot and could share information that was new to her. The fine house is on Main Street across from the Salem Tavern. Kathy, in turn, shared documents which helped fill in gaps and clarified information for me. She had found a document detailing the 1839 disposition of human property owned by Miss Limley's grandfather, Jacob Conrad, including Ned Limley, his siblings, and his mother. And the same for her grandmother, Elizabeth Conrad's property, including the sale of Man, Ned's father, to H.A. Limley. Following emancipation, Ned Limley married Alice Stiers. He was a communicant Moravian and was buried in the St. Philip II graveyard. Alice was buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery. Their son, Ed Limley, shown here, and his wife, Augusta, also lived in Happy Hill. Both worked in tobacco factories. They were buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery. Another early property owner was Elias Bidding, born about 1810, who had been enslaved by Elizabeth Bidding, a daughter of Anthony Bidding of Germantown. Elias's grandson, Wade Bidding Sr., is remembered as a Happy Hill neighborhood leader who advocated for many neighborhood improvements, including a bridge over Salem Creek, which was the neighborhood's link to Winston-Salem. The old one had washed away, and the crossing was especially dangerous for residents who crossed to walk to work. Finally, a lady fell and broke her leg fording the creek. Mr. Bidding appealed to his alderman, and in 1936, a bridge was built. The historic bridge was dedicated, memorialized to him in 2021. Mr. Bidding also successfully advocated for Happy Hill Park, the first for African American children in the city. Mr. Bidding and his wife Josephine Steele raised their family in Happy Hill. He worked in tobacco factories and attended St. James Episcopal Church, and she worked in the Salem College Laundry and attended Rising Ebenezer Baptist Church. Here is Mrs. Bidding photographed with her son, Wade Jr., in uniform. There were 10 children, at least 2 died as toddlers and were buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery. Infant and childhood mortality is reflected in Judy Cardwell's burial records, with 586 deaths of children 5 and under. The Bidding family continues to honor the neighborhood. Wade Jr.'s son, Rock Bidding, was the co-founder of the Happy Hill Reunion with Ben Piggott in 1994. Daughter Alice Bidding serves on the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association and helps steward the cemetery. The 1880s saw new neighborhood buildings in nearby counties, including Farmers Columbus Pitts from High Point and Harvey Alexander from Concord. Present-day Pitt Street and Alexander Street in Happy Hill bear their names. Mr. Pitts became a major landowner and farmed until his death. Mr. Alexander purchased the former Schumann house and the surrounding lots. The Alexander family owned the Schumann house until 1934, when a defaulted loan led to its loss and the subsequent purchase and demolition by Duke Power in 1939. Mr. Pitts and Mr. Alexander were born during the antebellum period and enslaved in their respective counties. They are among the 104 people recorded on Judy Cardwell's burial list who were born during slavery. Columbus Pitts married Alice Simmons and was active in the community. He helped establish a school in Happy Hill in 1910, which may have been the city's Salem Hill School, but it was called by the students School in the Pines. Mr. and Mrs. Pitts were buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery, and it is their granddaughter, Maurice Pitts Johnson, who has led preservation for years. The Happy Hill neighborhood continued to grow, and by the mid-1880s, cemetery land was beginning to be acquired at a high point in the neighborhood, where the star is here. Moe has speculated that burials may have predated a formal cemetery. Happy Hill Cemetery is sited along an early farm road that connected the former Negro quarter to the Schumann farm, and the farm road became Vargrave Street, shown here as a dashed line near the star. This aerial shows Happy Hill Cemetery in its present configuration along Willow Street and against Highway 52. The 5 parcels purchased by 2 churches in the 1880s and 90s remain part of the present configuration, although neither of the churches survived. Judy Cardwell documented the 5 parcels by deed purchased between 1886 and 1895, 4 owned by the Methodist Episcopal Church and 1 owned by the Liberia Baptist Church. A Methodist Episcopal Church was built at the top of Willow Street in what is now Happy Hill Cemetery and named St. James. But the congregation moved and merged with another church, and the building was later torn down. Its site became the burial ground. In 1892, Rising Ebenezer Baptist Church was the second church built in Happy Hill at the corner of Humphrey and Free Streets. Residents Harvey Alexander, who we've talked about, and a man named Robert Butler, a shoemaker, were trustees, and according to family history, the Reverend Alexander Hepler was instrumental in the church's founding. The first Rising Ebenezer Church, a frame building, was destroyed in a violent windstorm in 1917, and the lot across the street was purchased for construction of the present church on Free Street. Alexander Hepler was born in Salem, and he and his wife Cora lived in Happy Hill. He was a respected employee at Salem Academy and College. Reverend Hepler and Mrs. Hepler were both buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery, and their markers were among those recorded by the WPA in 1939. In the Pitts family archives is an undated cemetery document, Constitution and Laws of the Graveyard Association of Liberia, North Carolina, that includes a burial plot map. The orientation is east-west with the central avenue. Assigned sections were named with owners, and 2 large sections were reserved for children along the east end at the top. Plots were available for no less than $24, and graves could be sold for $2.50. I superimposed the archival map on the aerial with the location speculated according to existing headstones and clues from a family history written by Mrs. Johnson's father, Walter Pitts. With time, the graveyard expanded north, east, and west as the neighborhood grew steadily. The bird's eye view detail from 1891 shows Salem in the foreground and Happy Hill across the creek on the hillside, with 1-story houses along the street grid. The only 2-story house is the former Schumann house, then owned by the Alexander family. The star shows the general location of Happy Hill Cemetery. Walltown is seen in the background at the far right. The next year, in 1892, and just northeast of Happy Hill across Salem Creek, Simon Green Atkins founded Slater Industrial Academy in the new Columbian Heights neighborhood, where many professional blacks lived. The school became Winston-Salem State University. The sequence of burials within the Happy Hill Cemetery tract is presently unclear. According to Judy Cardwell's burial list, the first burial was Louis Yarborough, a 4-month-old infant who died on June 2, 1895, and burials occurred consistently throughout the following decades. In 1939, when the Works Progress Administration, excuse me, the WPA surveyed cemeteries in Winston-Salem, they surveyed the Happy Hill Cemetery. The survey recorded 33 burials, and Louis Yarborough was one of the burials listed. However, there were many burials which were not recorded, as grave markers may have been absent or vegetation may have obscured visibility. The WPA description of Happy Hill Cemetery in 1939 noted, quote, location on the southeast corner of Bargrave and Willow Streets in the Happy Hill section of Winston-Salem. The Happy Hill section is in the southern part of the city, end quote. It further recorded condition very bad. Following the railroad connection to Winston in 1873, R.J. Reynolds came the next year to establish his tobacco empire. His offer of manufacturing work then brought many rural African Americans to Winston-Salem, boosting the black population to nearly 40% by the turn of the century. The 1898 Democratic Party victory in North Carolina had solidified white supremacy, and African Americans endured growing racism and overall injustices. Winston and Salem grew side by side until the 1913 consolidation. The next year, the African church in Salem was named St. Philip's Moravian Church. Tobacco and textiles made Winston-Salem the largest and wealthiest city in North Carolina until the Great Depression, and African Americans participated in the growing economy with an influx of new residents and professional opportunities, but growing white supremacy threatened. Happy Hill developed steadily through the turn of the 20th century as a cohesive neighborhood with homes, churches, schools, stores, gathering places, and the cemetery. By the 1920s, Alder Street connected Happy Hill to the Lawtown Road, and the neighborhood expanded west, as you see on the Sanborn map from 1927. About 130 families lived on the beautiful rolling landscape above Salem Creek. Over half of the families owned their own homes. Many worked in tobacco factories, furniture manufacturing, lumber yards, and at Salem Academy and College. And others were day laborers, barbers, drivers, domestic workers, laundresses, and more. Families lived in framed cottages, bungalows, and shotgun houses with front porches. Some residents farmed. Most everyone raised a vegetable garden. Poultry and pigs were kept in backyards and side yards. Residents cultivated ornamental places for beauty and enjoyment with shrubbery, flowers, trellising, fencing, and decorative furniture. There was much visiting, and children enjoyed playing outside. Early to mid-20th century houses still survive in Happy Hill. Many new Happy Hill residents moved from other counties and adjacent states for employment opportunities. George Dunlap and his wife Cynthia moved from Lancaster, South Carolina in 1916 and bought a house at the corner of Free and Pitt Street. Their daughter Maggie and her family came too. Mr. Dunlap worked at Forsyth Furniture and also did odd jobs for Moravian archivist Adelaide Freeze. Mrs. Dunlap worked at the Salem Academy Laundry. At their desks, the Dunlaps, daughter Maggie, her husband Robert McMurray, and their son Nebraska were all buried in the Happy Hill Cemetery. Happy Hill Cemetery also included burials of many people who lived beyond Happy Hill neighborhood. Ellis C. Brown was born in Roanoke, Virginia, and recorded in the 1923 Winston-Salem City Directory as a domestic who lived on 14th Street. Her marker remains in Happy Hill Cemetery. A 1948 aerial shows row after row of graves in a landscape with evergreen trees, outlined family plots, and walking paths. Approximately 100 visible grave markers have been mapped. However, there are hundreds of unmarked burials and many broken markers. Generations of people are buried there. Oral history recorded the entry to the cemetery at the south end, where you see the blue arrow, where wagons would enter carrying caskets from Bargrave Street, and the path is shown on this arrow. Neighborhoods in Winston-Salem were tightly segregated in the early 20th century. City directories inform African American presence on the Salem landscape. At left in 1912, small yellow dots indicate households. The larger blue dots indicate numbers of households. Black people had lived in Salem since the colonial period, but Jim Crow laws changed. It became a segregated white neighborhood by the first decades of the 20th century, and the Black Presence became a hidden town. St. Philip's Moravian Church is marked with the gold star. The congregation was at that site for more than 100 years when Old Salem Museum was established in 1950 to restore the town. St. Philip's had wanted to move for decades, and they did so in 1952. They moved across the creek to Happy Hill under the leadership of their first black pastor. Dramatic change came to Happy Hill in the 1950s when a major part of the neighborhood was torn down to make way for the construction of the city's first public housing project, Happy Hill Gardens. 14 city blocks of Happy Hill were demolished, including houses, stores, and more, to make way for the new development. This included the earliest residential lots of Ned Lindley and Richard Sievers. The rectangular buildings that you see on this sandworn and the blue and white buildings on the map are the new apartments built on the old grid and also on new curvilinear streets. Oral history recorded grave removal during this time as the Housing Authority prepared land for apartment construction adjacent to Happy Hill Cemetery. People recalled major land cutting at the cemetery edges that removed grave markers and burials with the excavated dirt that was put in dump trucks and hauled away. As Judy Cardwell observed in her report, quote, "Likely these burials were outside the Happy Hill Cemetery property, since boundaries of the cemetery were not marked in any way." End quote. The new apartments would help house hundreds of African American families who were displaced when they lost their homes in East Winston and other areas to new highways. The first section of I-40 in North Carolina came through downtown Winston-Salem in the 1950s. And in the 1960s and 1970s, US Highway 52 brought significant damage north-south and directly impacted Happy Hill. The 40-52 highway intersection is shown here, looking across to what is now the Innovation Quarter. Residential security maps, or redlining, were formal means of racial discrimination in the United States, where neighborhoods were graded for quality and desirability. The 1937 map of Winston-Salem shows African Americans in red, for D, the fourth grade and the least desirable. In green is A, the first grade and most desirable neighborhoods, including Buena Vista. The implications were severe, as black neighborhoods were highlighted as high risks and denied loans or fair loans, and homes were undervalued, all depriving African Americans of wealth building. Municipal infrastructure was withheld from black neighborhoods and led to disrepair, which often ended with demolition. Public policy targeted black neighborhoods for urban renewal and highway development. I've added the highway corridors to the redlining map, and you can see how Interstate 40 and US 52 blasted through stable African American neighborhoods in the 1950s to the 70s. The purple circle indicates Happy Hill, where Highway 52 impacted the neighborhood. The new highway alignments were a connected-eye exercise across black neighborhoods: East Winston, Columbian Heights, Happy Hill, and further into Walltown Bellevue. Destruction included homes, businesses, churches, livelihoods, and social fabric, and forced grave removal from cemeteries. Indeed, preparation for US Highway 52, the corridor, in the 1960s severely impacted the Happy Hill Cemetery and the neighborhood. St. Philip's new church, homes, and businesses were in the new right-of-way and were demolished. In 1966, approximately 200 graves were removed from the east end of the Happy Hill Cemetery. This land was then subsumed by the construction of US 52. The top aerial shows you is in 1958, before the grave removal, and you can see that Bargrave Street is the east side of the cemetery in its original form. And then the lower aerial is from 1972, which shows the truncated portion where 52 is now the border along the east side of the graveyard. In addition to its destruction, the expressway was and is an impenetrable barrier at the east side of Happy Hill, where vehicular noise and pollution have negatively affected generations of residents. These photos shot last year show the truncated cemetery and proximity of graves to the expressway. Shameful treatment of sacred ground. Judy Cardwell's research documented the highway project and the removal of graves that included 16 marked and many unmarked burials. An NCDOT memo from August 1966, noted, quote, "There are no known relatives of the deceased buried in Happy Hill Cemetery affected by the proposed right-of-way. Please note that only a portion of this cemetery is in the right-of-way, and there is a large area of the cemetery not affected," end quote. 200 graves were removed from the Happy Hill Cemetery and reinterred at the Nat Watkins property in Walkertown, adjacent to Oak Grove Baptist Church on Pine Hall Road. And the entire Bellevue Cemetery of approximately 600 graves in Walltown was also moved there. The Watkins family received $10 for each grave removed to their land. Brian and I visited the cemetery in the fall of 2023 and found it to be a pine-wooded tract with some markers, but mostly unmarked burials. So this is the DOT memo that had the list of the people that were moved, and we were able to find 2 of those, Fanny Scales and Carol. But many had metal markers that had paper that, of course, was gone on it. It was very sad. But you can go there and see it. Happy Hill experienced a century of intrusion and destruction from outside forces, and each time neighborhood health declined. By the turn of the 21st century, HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, was reconsidering public housing throughout the country. In the early 2000s, the HUD Hope 6 project impacted Happy Hill through a redevelopment plan that included the demolition of Happy Hill Gardens under the Housing Authority. In 2005, prior to the apartment demolition, the Housing Authority engaged Wake Forest Archaeology for archaeological assessment of the lot adjacent to the west property line of Happy Hill Cemetery, which is where people recall graves being dug up and put in dump trucks. The project determined that, quote, "Although we found that some cemetery graves were located within a foot or 2 of the residential lot, our investigations did not identify any graves directly within the residential lot of the apartments," end quote. This was expected since the residential lot had been cut much lower than the cemetery during site preparation in 1950. The observation that graves were within a foot or 2, though, underscores the question of grave intrusion and removal remembered by residents. Wake Forest Archaeology commented in their letter that the Happy Hill Cemetery, quote, "is a highly significant historic property because of its association with Happy Hill and the early African American community of Winston-Salem. The cemetery needs to be cleaned up, documented, and restored to its historical condition so it can assume its prominence within the historic community," end quote. The demolition of Happy Hill Gardens proceeded, and once again, residents were displaced. And I will say that the Hope 6 project had envisioned multifamily housing over the tract where all these apartments had been, but in fact, to date, they have built a block of apartments and a block of condominiums and some single-family houses and a few other apartment blocks. But most of the land there, if you've driven in Happy Hill, is covered in kudzu. It's beautiful rolling land with big willow oak trees, which were planted in the 1950s, but it has not, this is like promises unfulfilled. Around this time, 2005, 2007, the sacred ground was lost in tangles, and Mrs. Johnson was unable to locate her grandparents' graves. She asked for help from the Housing Authority, and unbeknownst to her, until it was too late, they sent a crew with heavy machinery to clear the cemetery. What she found were broken and damaged grave markers, gouged land, and gravestones pushed into the ground. With assistance from restoration architect David Gall, Mrs. Johnson then focused on retrieval and preservation. This was in 2009 when she reached out to Mo at Old Salem Archaeology for help to properly address the cemetery needs. She also encouraged Rising Ebenezer Baptist Church, and they have been a partner for the past 15 years. But the tangle remained too much for volunteers, even with monthly cleanings, and 2/3 of the cemetery remained impenetrable. In the summer and fall of 2023, Greg Errett, a retired city transportation engineer who is very active in the Oddfellow Cemetery, led a major effort to uncover the rest of the cemetery, revealing many more slumped graves and some markers. And it was at this time, last November, that Brian discovered his great-grandmother's grave. It was a very powerful moment for this young man who's in his early 30s. He had been looking for Alice Pitt's grave, and it was under all of this residue, and he went to the graveyard. It was after we had made the presentation for the historic marker, and he did a great job, but we didn't know yet that we got a big marker. But he went out to the cemetery with his mother, and he felt drawn to this place that had been newly cleared, and those are the toes of his feet. He took this picture looking down on Alice Pitt's marker, which of course has been crushed, probably by that machinery.
Wow.
But amazing moment for him. Brian and I prepared a strategic plan for the cemetery, including care of grave goods, like the one you see there, and potential ground-penetrating radar and archaeological attention. Mo gave Brian a lesson in archaeology as they sensitively revealed burial duties for a grave near his great-grandmother's. And of course, you know Brian's grandmother, Maurice Fitz-Johnson, who I talked about. She's a board member of the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association, and with her blessing, that organization has really taken on the leadership role for the cemetery. And by December 2023, they were interested in ground-penetrating radar and asked for assistance. At the corner of Cemetery Street and Salem Avenue lies an inconspicuous graveyard adjacent to the grand and impressive Salem Cemetery. This was historically known as the Second Colored Cemetery. In 1859, it was the continuation of the Negro God's Acre at St. Philip's. Phoebe is buried there, and the WA on her marker indicated that she was owned by the Wachovia administration. Her markers survived, but mostly the graveyard was unmarked, and that's an image of this graveyard from 2008. Retrieval of the Second Colored Cemetery, now known as St. Philip's Second Graveyard, became a priority when David Brokstone was Director of Facilities for the Salem congregation. He is a former colleague from Old Salem who, with John Larson, led the restoration of the St. Philip's complex, including the unmarked graveyards. In the summer of 2018, David engaged Sarah Moore & Associates of Boone, North Carolina, to conduct ground-penetrating radar on the half-acre lot, and 331 unmarked graves were located. At the head of each grave, Sarah Moore installed a metal rod into the ground for location so that subsequently, with a metal detector, those could be found, and each burial could have a marker placed. And David had markers engraved with the word beloved, because it's not known who's where, but it marks every grave that was found. Then archival records provided further information, and 31 of the graves were subsequently marked with identifying information, and that happened in November of 2021, a major anniversary for Home Moravian Church. A substantial fence and a portal similar to God's Acre helped to formalize the burial ground. The Easter sunrise service now includes this Moravian graveyard. And in my mind, this project could be a model for the Happy Hill Cemetery. And with a directive from the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association, I reached out to Sarah Moore & Associates in early 2024 for a consultation and a proposed budget to conduct ground-penetrating radar on the 2-acre Happy Hill parcel with mapping and marking of graves. By March of last year, we had a contract for $20,000 and an anonymous funder. On April 1st, 2024, Sarah Moore began the Happy Hill Cemetery project. There remained much overgrowth, down limbs, and brush at the west end, but enough of the cemetery was open to start. In the photo at left, Principal Keith Sarah in the orange is a geologist, and he's a professor at Appalachian State University. And to his left is Greg Arrett, who continued land clearing of the cemetery so the GPR could continue. The Sarah Moore team is highly regarded and works all over the Southeast. They also recently did the Adam Spot Rock House for the Wachovia Historical Society. For the Happy Hill Cemetery, they returned on numbers of occasions and concluded their site work in the fall and submitted their report in October 2024. The results are significant and provide opportunity to reveal and preserve the cemetery. I will now share the report directly from Keith and Sarah Moore, and these are his words and images. And some of it's a little technical, but I tried to take those hard places out. A field reconnaissance was conducted across the cemetery to identify and flag burials. These burials were located at existing headstones and field stones and by observing depressions and vegetation changes above unmarked burials. Some of the depressions observed were unusually deep. Soil penetration testing with a steel probe was also employed in some areas. Some members of the Happy Hill community came by and shared their knowledge of the cemetery. One community member stated that his grandfather was a grave digger for the cemetery, and 3 churches use the cemetery for their members. He stated that the churches would assign a burial plot to each family, and that family members would be buried in this plot on top of each other. Multiple burials in a single grave shaft could explain the deep depressions observed in the cemetery. A ground-penetrating radar survey was completed using 2 pieces of equipment: a GPR system on a 3-wheeled cart, which you saw a picture of a minute ago, to collect the grid data, and an SIR 4000 antenna was pulled across the ground surface on a sled in areas inaccessible to the 3-wheeled cart. The GPR system sent pulses of electromagnetic energy, or radar, into the earth through a transmitter. The radar waves propagate through the subsurface and are partially reflected back to the receiver when materials with different electromagnetic characteristics are encountered. Soil that is excavated and used to backfill a grave shaft can have different conductivity than the surrounding undisturbed soil. Changes in subsurface materials, such as disturbed soil in a grave shaft and vaults or intact coffins in a grave, can be detected by GPR systems. The GPR systems detect these changes and show them as reflections or anomalies on the radar profile. Non-rectangular grids were laid out at the cemetery. You see those in red. The grid data was collected along transects at 1-foot spacing in a north-south direction. And you see the transects. 90 additional transects of GPR data were collected along the southern edge of the cemetery where they pulled the sled across. That was the really hilly part. The GPR data was processed using 3D imaging. Some of the unmarked burials were identified by high amplitude reflections. Potential burials were also observed in the shallow GPR depth slices as rows of reflection-free or blue rectangles. Homogeneous backfill in the grave shaft produces these reflection-free rectangles. The GPR profiles were also reviewed to identify additional burials not observed on the GPR depth slices. Unmarked graves can be represented as a distinct reflection on the GPR profiles. Older graves can be recognized by disturbed reflections at the depth where the grave shaft cuts into the underlying soil horizons. A total of 1,173 anomalies interpreted as potential burials were identified in the GPR data. Headstones or field stones were associated with 148 of the potential burials. In some places, it is difficult to tell which of these grave markers are associated with which anomalies. Some of the markers are on the east side of the anomaly, where headstones are typically on the west side of the burial. In some areas, there is a scatter of field stones amongst numerous anomalies. An additional 36 grave markers were mapped where GPR anomalies were not identified in the GPR data. This indicates that there are at least 1,173 burials in the cemetery. 184 of these burials appear to be marked, and 989 are potential unmarked burials. A Leica Geosystems total station was used to survey the unmarked burials, marked burials, and other cemetery features. The headstones, footstones, and curbing observed at the cemetery were photographed and cataloged. A map of the cataloged cemetery features is shown. So all of the markings, whether it's just a field stone or a grave good or whatever was present culturally, was mapped. So you can see how valuable that information is. The geophysics report provides significant data and information. If Judy recorded in her list, which she noted is incomplete, 1,453 burials, less than 1,173 Sarah anomalies, that equals 280 less the 200 removed by NCDOT. That leaves 80 outstanding with the current data we have. But don't we know more than we did? My gosh. I've encouraged the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association leadership to consider marking the graves as was done at the St. Philip's Second Graveyard. I introduced Happy Hill Neighborhood Association President Tanya Sheffield to the Salem congregation staff, Bridget Smith and David Bergstone, who were very supportive and willing to help Happy Hill in whatever they may do. Grave markers indicate burials and impact us in a different way than looking at a grassy lawn. The metal rods installed by Sarah at the head of each grave in the Happy Hill Cemetery can then be located with a metal detector and then marked. The beloved is a beautiful way to mark an unmarked grave, I think. Tanya, the president of Happy Hill Neighborhood Association, would also like to create a Vietnam veterans-like memorial wall with the names of the people buried in the cemetery, which I think is an extraordinary idea, so that potential descendants or descendants can come and find their relatives. And of course, Judy's thorough and detailed burial list is what will be able to populate that. The historic marker for Happy Hill Cemetery will be installed in May, probably on Friday, May 23rd. And then there will also be a Memorial Day service as well. The public is invited to vote. So what is the outlook? Happy Hill Cemetery offers much for the Winston-Salem community, not only through visibility and recognition of African American history, but also as a spiritual beacon for neighborhood pride and revitalization. The potential for research associated with the cemetery is immense. Judy Cardwell's burial list is a significant link into the social history of Winston-Salem. There is also opportunity to study late 19th to mid-20th century funerary tradition, including landscape design and grave art. Archaeological and horticultural survey can record flora, paths, grave goods, landscape features, as well as the extent of burials at the perimeter. Ground penetrating radar has located individual burials for generations of Winston-Salem residents, and appropriate marking could reveal the landscape as sacred burial ground and honor those who are gone but not forgotten. At the cemetery and beyond, revitalization is happening in Happy Hill. Tricultural Arts is transforming the last two remaining shotgun houses as a legacy site, and the Liberian Organization of Piedmont is planning international student housing. What was once a land of slavery is a land of freedom that needs our support for repair and to thrive. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? I know you guys work in this kind of information all the time, and there are so many cemeteries in need. But I encourage you to go by Happy Hill and walk around.
About 20 years ago, I went out there and I walked back over where it looks like there's a little wagon road.
That's the little path.
And there were like 4 or 5 stones. It's like somebody just threw them over there. And I didn't know if that was part of the graveyard or not, but obviously it's part of the road.
It's been very mistreated.
Yeah.
Now, the 200 graves that were moved initially,
Right.
what did they do with those? I'm sorry.
They're at the Nat Watkins property in
Okay,
Right.
Watertown property,
Yeah,
okay.
on Pine Hall Road. And you can go there. The family, the Nat Watkins family, provided that piece of property for DOT, and all the graves were reinterred there. I don't know how in the world that works, but it doesn't sound very possible, but I guess. Anyway,
Okay.
question over here? Somewhere? No? Everybody good? Well, I'm the director of Marine Research at Old Salem, as you know, and I am in the Horton Center at Old Salem, where MESDA is located. So, you know, that's where our library is, and the MESDA Research Center. So if any of you all, you know, that is open to the public. You can come, you can call and schedule a visit or whatever, but we would love to support, you know, your great work as well. Yes?
Is there anyone available to offer guidance with a tour?
Of the research area?
For Happy Hill?
Oh, well, not presently, but I think it's just right here is the sidewalk on Willow Street, and you can, now the cemetery is fully clear, which it hasn't been for maybe forever, and you can just, you know, just wander in there. It's open, and there are apartments across the street. There's not an organized tour, but that's a great idea, and I'll pass that along to the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association. Yeah, thank you.
Are there people working to identify the beloveds so that they can?
In the Salem Cemetery?
At Happy Hill, I was just
Oh,
wondering.
well,
like-
there are no beloveds here.
Oh, there are-
No,
oh.
that's what I proposed them to do.
Oh.
The
there aren't any
beloveds
yet.
are
Okay.
in the St. Philip's
Okay.
second graveyard.
And they
That's-
are working on those because you said 31 of them. have been-
Well, they had archival information from
Okay.
Guardian Archives. There was a map of the enslaved people owned by the Freeze family
Okay.
that identified and they were able to, without question, because you don't want to misname a grave, without question, to be able to put the name and if they
Okay.
knew the birth date and the death date. That has not happened here.
That's-
You go there and, there are some incidental stones like you see, but you saw the map of the
Yeah.
anomalies. It's full of graves. So that's what I'm proposing would make such a visual
It would.
difference if
yeah.
there were, 1,173 markers on
Yeah.
this land that you see. So, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But I'm sure they'll continue at Salem Congregation. They may find more information or map, but they're, we don't have that for Happy Hill.
They
Yes.
used to call that corner the Stranger's Graveyard. When I was
Okay.
first looking up graveyard
Oh,
stuff.
really?
1983. It's been a while.
Okay, well,
I could never figure out,
Well,
seems
it's-
like that's a lot of strangers to die in Old Salem.
down at St. Philip's, there is the Stranger's Graveyard.
And there is
the
a
Negro
Stranger's
Graveyard.
Graveyard. So I was like,
But the
do
one,
they
no.
really know what they're talking
No,
about?
no, the one at the corner,
Think that's,
but it was sort of forgotten. The last burials were in the 1960s.
it was rough looking the first time I went there.
Oh, yeah, and a lot of those stones disappear. I hear some college students fraternity.
Yeah, they were
I'm sure
turning
you all
back
know
into
about
sand.
But it was pretty forgotten.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and so it wasn't until, the past 5, 6 years, 7, 8 years that there's been, there has been attention on that graveyard, but not
Yeah,
the
I
kind
was
that
there
makes
when
it
they did the dedication.
so visually
Laying down the
different.
new,
Yeah,
there
it
were
was in
so
the
many
paper.
people that wanted to set one down, and
Yeah,
I
it
just
was a
sit
big
down, but
deal.
anyway.
Yeah. And that was a powerful time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, there's great hope, but go visit, walk around, and I will mention that to the Happy Hill Neighborhood Association, if people are interested in tours. And, they're a small nonprofit.
Even if it's like every couple of months of organized day.
Oh, that's a nice idea, like on a certain Saturday or
Yeah.
Sunday afternoon. That's a really nice
And ask
idea.
for donations.
Yeah, that's a super idea. Well, if they, to install, David told me that those beloved markers were not very expensive, and they got them from a local, they're concrete, they're not marble.
Right.
But they serve as the base then for if you can identify, you put that on top. But I think they were $15 each, so, 15 pounds a thousand.
Oh,
15,000,
Yeah.
So that'd be a big project, but
Right.
they have the metal rods. David Hard, our archaeology metal detector, and was able to, put them in. But it makes a huge difference, I think. So, great ideas, y'all. Thank you so much. I'm going to put in a plug for Old Salem. As you all may know, we are still recovering from COVID. Our staff has decreased immensely, and we are trying really hard. So I've left some membership brochures if any of y'all are interested. Seniors are $45 a year, and students are as well. But we'd love to have you all join and be a part of Old Salem and help to support the museum and the work that we do. But I do invite you to come do your research if you need to. And thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you.